In the history of Christianity, the greatest theological doctrinal disagreement between the Catholics and the Protestant is the doctrine of grace. It is a question of whether we are justified by grace alone or whether we are saved by good works. And this tension in underscoring the importance of grace and also good works is something that has been more or less resolved today. And yet there is still much misunderstanding among Catholics and Protestants. The Catholic Church has always emphasized that it is true that we are justified by grace, but this grace must be seen in good works. Otherwise, we cannot say that we have received the grace of God. And so, how then do we understand this relationship between grace and good works in the role of salvation? In order to help us to understand this development of the doctrine of grace, we must go back to the history of the church. In one of the first heresies against the doctrine of grace was the person by the name of Pelagius. Pelagius taught the doctrine of salvation through our efforts alone. For him, Christ was simply an exemplar, a good mentor, a good example to show us how to live a good life. And so, for Pelagius, the work of Jesus is to show us the way, to teach us how to live a good life, to be good. But we have to use all our efforts in order to be saved by following after Jesus, by imitating him, using our own strength. This is called the heresy of Pelagianism. In underscoring the importance of human efforts in order to be saved, Pelagius was actually denying the grace of salvation, which means to say you have to earn salvation. If that is the case, you do not need Jesus really. But this would deny the doctrine, the Christian doctrine, that Jesus is the Savior of all. And so, in order to resolve this issue, the disciples of Pelagius, after him, compromised and said, the initial grace must come from Christ. But after that, it's all your own efforts. But that is, again, too much emphasis on efforts, denying that the grace of God prevails from beginning to end in our salvation. And so Martin Luther came along and he propounded the doctrine of justification by faith alone. When he read Romans, and Romans says we are justified by his grace alone, that was the turning point in Martin Luther's life. So Martin Luther, justification by grace alone, is actually a doctrine accepted by the Catholic Church. We are not in disagreement with that. The problem is when it just ends there. And that's why the disciples of Martin Luther, those who understood the doctrine in a very simplistic way, that it is just by grace alone, we do not need good works to be saved, it has become disastrous for them. Costly grace has become cheap grace. That means grace without discipleship, grace without conversion, forgiveness without confession. And this is where some Christians, even some Catholics, when we talk about justification by grace alone, they say, oh, so I believe that Jesus saved me, so I don't have to do anything. That is not true. Because we know that we have accepted the grace of God only when we manifest this grace we have received in the good works that we do. We know that we have truly received this unconditional love and mercy when we live a good life. So the fruits of grace must be seen. So how do you know you are saved? How do you know you receive the grace of God? In your good works. And therefore, the church's teaching is We are saved by grace alone. That is true. But we need to cooperate with the grace that we have received. Even this cooperation is the grace of God. Because without His love, we will not have the capacity to love. So even the capacity to do good is not our efforts alone. It is the work of God's grace. Consequently, from beginning to end, it is always the grace of God. And we respond by cooperating with this grace given to us.